Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and today we're going to do a viewer games show. So there's the thread available on the training videos from the Masters directory, and I think generally Josh will post a link to it whenever he presents one of these viewer games shows. So if he's done it, then you can just go ahead and connect to it straight away. And if you want to present a game, what I'd ask you to do is to please put the game in PGN notation so I can just cut and paste it into my browser. That makes things very easy, and you can even include annotations if you want. If you just have really a question about some specific moment in the game, though, it might be better if you put it in the viewer questions thread instead. So either way, I will try my best to get to it. I would prefer if you just present one game or just post one game per, let's say, batch. So after I do a show, if you want to present another game in another batch, then that can be okay. But just so I don't get overworked, and also so other people's games will be included and I don't have to choose, please just present one game, as I said, per show or per potential show. Okay, well, let me go ahead and begin here. So this first game is between Derek S. and Dan D. And submitted by Dan, who I know. He used to live in this area and go to the chess club here. So really he's interested especially in one particular move, so I'll discuss that. Okay, so he had black, so let me go ahead and flip the board around for those of you who prefer to view things from the questioner's or submitter's perspective. Alright, so we've got a King's Indian, 4 pawns attack, a very bloodthirsty, aggressive line by white. There's a book that just came out last year. I think it was by Semkov, the guy who's the main organizer behind the Chess Stars series, and he's a strong IM in his own right. And he just wrote a book on it last year on the 4 pawns attack, or maybe it was even earlier this year, which he called Kill Kid. So Kill the King's Indian Defense, Volume 1. So that's exactly what this opening variation tries to do. It tries to show that this wall of pawns is too strong, that black has given up too much space, and that white can just blast off and crush him. Doesn't always work, but it is a dangerous line. Now here, Dan came up with, I don't know if it's a novelty, but it at least doesn't appear in the list of moves in PowerBook. So it mentions about 12 moves here. So C5 is the main move, Knight A6, which is what I've generally played when I've played the King's Indian and faced the 4 pawns attack. There's Bishop to G4, there's A6, C6, Knight B to D7, E5, Knight F to D7, Knight C6, E6, B6, Knight E8, and even B5 was played once. But no Knight H5s. So this is definitely a pretty provocative move. I mean, it makes sense on the one hand, trying to unmask the bishop on G7's diagonal, maybe prepare C5 or E5. So it's quite interesting. Maybe he's onto something here. Anyway, well, it worked out in this game. So white played bishop to D3, Knight C6, hitting the D pawn, bishop to E3, E5, takes, D5, Knight to D4, Queen to D2. And now the move that he was really curious in. But I actually like this Knight to H5 idea. I wonder, you know, I didn't really computer check it or anything, but it's it looks like a logical plan. Anyway, the move that Dan played here and that he was interested in was Knight to F4. And before I get to it, I'll just say that I think bishop to G4 might be the best move, since it prevents castling queenside and does have a concrete threat. And I think white has to respond to this in a way that'll be just a little bit awkward, whatever he does. So this might be the best move, but Knight F4 I think is fine. I don't think this is a bad move at all. The only drawback, though it's not really a drawback, is that white doesn't have to take it. So white could play something like castling long. And this was, of course, impossible on bishop to G4, because, okay, if castle's queenside, well, then knight takes F3, GF, bishop F3 really puts a damper on things for white. So after knight f4, white could castle, and after, let's say, takes, maybe try queen to h4, attempting to blockade the king side. But I think white can make progress. So something like king to b1, getting out of the way, and then to play bishop to c2, maybe rook to g1, and then knight to e2, aiming to evict this powerful knight on f4. Still, black has many things that can be done too. For instance, it can play for queenside play like this, but okay, white's probably a little bit better here. So, with black not having a d6 pawn anymore, maybe b5 can be met by c5, and b4 would just chase the white knight to e2 where it wants to go. So I think white is a little bit better, but not a lot. Anyway, after knight to f4, white played the principal, but probably just mistaken. Bishop takes f4. So Dan took, queen takes f4, and now, not the only move, but a very logical one, f5. And one point, simple tactical point, is that e5 fails here. So knight takes f3 check, and if gf, bishop takes e5, with the point that queen e5, rook e8 simply wins for black. And if white can't go grabbing like that, then this f5 break is going to lead to a lot of open lines. But it looks as if white should simply not be afraid of ghosts and castle kingside. And if he does this, he's probably okay. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any way to exploit either this kind of ghost of a threat with knight to e2, and f takes e4, queen e4. It's not really apparent that black has anything concrete. It's surprising, but white seems to be okay. On the other hand, black is okay too. And here's an interesting forcing variation. So bishop f5, takes, and now queen h4. And I would say black has more or less satisfactory compensation for the pawn. So he's got very good control over the dark squares, his pieces are active, and so on. Now the funny line is rook 8 f1, queen d4, takes, king h1, and then taking on c3. Now, if white recaptures the bishop, then after trading and rook to e8, black has full compensation here. I mean, white's queenside pawns are all very weak, and black's rook is going to be active, while white's rook has no way to penetrate and cause black any trouble at all at the moment. But you might wonder, well, what about rook takes f8? I mean, this is a king and pawn ending where white's a pawn up. However, black's king is better, gets there faster, and white's weak queenside pawns give black equality, but maybe not more. So king e7, c5, and here black could play b6, and this will regain the pawn pretty easily, or he could play king f6, and now play b6. Note that king to e5, well, it's okay. Black is still going to have to play b6, because after c4, of course, king d4 loses to d6. Okay, so the point of all of this then is that black seems to be okay, about equal. Instead, white played castling queenside, which is a blunder for a reason we'll see in a few moves. So fe was played, and it's correct. Knight f3 was correct. But here, Dan missed an opportunity. He played queen f6. The position is equal, though he went on to win. I would say black certainly still has very good compensation here. No problems. However, black did miss a win. You might want to see if you can find it. It is kind of unusual. Well, here it is. Bishop to h6 check. Okay, this seems innocent enough. King to b1. Now rook to e8. And all of a sudden, we ask the question where white's queen is going. There's not really any good answer. There's only one square it can move to that's safe, and that's queen to d4. So that's why we needed to play bishop to h6 check first to take away the f4 square. But now, bishop to e3 and the queen's a goner. So Dan could have won like this, and it would have been very nice, but he went on to win anyway. Okay, well, we'll skip the rest of the game and move on to the other ones, since there are quite a few here in our list. Okay. This is between William Bodenhop and Alejandro Linares Puente, or Linares, I should say, Puente. So this was submitted by White, aka the Pawn Storm, as a Class B player. And this was basically a correspondence game. And what he wanted to know, well, okay, he asked a few things. So one thing he said is, wants to know is what I think of correspondence chess. Is this a good way of improving one's chess, or do I prefer the people behind the board method? I would say that I think that correspondence chess is excellent. This is a great way to improve your chess, and a great way especially to study your openings. There are few better ways, really, because unlike, let's say, just trying to learn out of a book, the problem with learning out of a book is that it's a little bit dull and dry, of course, and you're not really emotionally invested, so it's easy to forget what you've gotten out of the book unless you, again, are immediately playing it, putting it into action. The problem with tournament chess, of course, is that you don't get to play as often, and again, it's it's briefer, so you are more emotionally involved when you're doing your analysis afterward, but you don't necessarily want to discover everything all at once. But with correspondence, you get to just keep soaking in the variation, so you're studying it more and more every move, if you really take your time for it. So I think correspondence chess is one of the absolute best ways to improve your chess in general, and your opening prep in particular. Okay, and then he also was curious about some features of the isolated queen pawn, and said this is his first isolated queen pawn game. So let's take a look. So e4, c6, d4, d5, takes, c4. So the Peynov Botvinnik attack, this will get you your isolated pawn. So knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight f3. And here black played a kind of peculiar move, bishop to d6, which kind of gives the worst of all possible worlds here for black of the various bishop moves. Okay, bishop to a3 is worse than bishop to d6, but bishop to e7 and bishop to b4 are both more logical and better, I would say. So bishop to b4 is putting some token pressure with this pin, while bishop to e7 is very solid. It prevents there from being a pin by white with bishop to g5, and it keeps the d5 pawn protected with pieces, so white can't force an isolated pawn back on black here. And the other problem with bishop to d6 is that white can very seriously consider this queenside expansion with c5, since this is coming with tempo here, and it also means that white can play can play b4 and a3 without worrying about a5 and a takes b4. So white will have time to bring his bishop from c1 out of the way. All right, well, bishop to d3 happened. Takes, castles, knight b to d7, bishop to g5. And, okay, so we've got, again, a typical isolated queen pawn position, but with the funny bishop on d6, which favors white, because now there's this pin that's not blocked. Secondly, it makes d5 easier for white to achieve. And d5 is often quite useful for white. Sometimes it can just be a liquidator, so everything gets traded off and black just gets to equalize. But if white has more control over the center, then d5 can actually give him an advantage. And in fact, after b6, white asked if d5 is already possible, and in fact it is. Probably black's best is to play knight to e5, but okay, after select bishop to b3, h6, so this is actually his own line, bishop a6, rook e1. White seems to be doing quite okay here. So actually this last move looks a little bit funny. I mean, maybe knight takes e5 can be played too. But, well, white, again, looks a little bit more comfortable here to me. Another line he gives is e5, knight e4. And the problem is that bishop to e7 is met by d6. While after queen c7, okay, then taking twice, followed by rook c1, and then maybe knight h4, again gives white better play. It might be even better than this, but anyway, d5 I think does give some advantage. Alright, so the game continued rook to e1, typical play, though maybe queen to e2 and rook a to d1 might be a little bit more to the point. Because after rook e1 and then queen to e2, the rook and the queen are kind of superfluous. I mean, one piece is unnecessary for this aim of playing knight to e5. Anyway, knight to e5 happened now, and here black is in some trouble. Alright, black played rook to c8, And in this position, white made kind of a typical move for isolated pawn positions, but it's important to always stay mentally flexible in chess. So a move like bishop to b3 or bishop to d3 is very, very standard in an isolated queen pawn position, but here, given the special characteristics of the position with the goofy bishop on d6 and the at least questionable rook on e8, white had a very good move here, which was bishop to b5, taking advantage of these double pins here. Black is already in big trouble in this position, so this would have been close to winning. Alright, well instead, as I said, bishop to b3 happened, a6, rook a to d1, queen c7, and black is now actually kind of okay here. So he's broken the pin. The f7 e6 complex is adequately guarded, so knight takes f7 stuff really isn't that dangerous. You know, knight f7 followed by bishop e6 doesn't really lead to much here. And black is starting to have a little pressure on e5 and maybe the potential of taking there and playing queen c6 at some moment. Okay, well, white tried bishop to c2, which I think would have, if that's the case, maybe bishop to d3 earlier would have been better than bishop to b3, although bishop to b5 was best of all. Okay, and now black continues to make progress with b5, which is good. However, after bishop to b1, black blunders, and white finishes pretty nicely. So black played knight to d5. It's a good move to make in principle, but there is a big tactical problem with this. Okay, do you see it? And this is a trick that does happen fairly often in the isolated queen pawn positions. So you want to pay attention. It's bishop h7 check. Okay, and the point is, of course, if king takes h7, queen h5 check, king g8, queen f7, king, let's say h8, and rook to d3, followed by rook to h3, and this is lights out. So that's the way to go here. Oops, sorry about that. So white is winning here, and so black decided to try his luck just a pawn down here with king f8. And white has a lot of good moves here, but decided to simply play bishop to b1 to save this bishop, get it out of the way of any g6 problems, and maybe play queen h5 and queen h8 next. Okay, black took, and he brought the king back. Okay, queen h5, knight f8, covering h7. The problem is that black no longer has an h7 pawn, so rook to d3 is a good move, and now black is clearly dead here. Okay, he played knight to e7, rook h3, knight e to g6, and white finished nicely here. Simply bishop takes, simply bishop takes g6. Black had to play f takes g6 here, and then after check, bishop f6 looks like a very good move. So there's no way to defend g7 except by taking. But then queen takes f6, and rook h8 is mate. So instead, black preferred knight takes g6, and this works well in all variations but one. And that variation is check, and mate. So nice game by white. Missed the one opportunity with bishop to b5 and maybe played a little bit stereotypically, but that stereotypical attack can be very dangerous. And again, black, for his part, I think first really went off the rails with bishop to d6. I mean, this is just not a good move. So bishop to e7 is the way to proceed. Okay, so let's continue here. This is submitted by Wuzhe. I'm not sure how he wants to pronounce his handle, W-Z-H-E. I think elsewhere he just goes by King Runner. Anyway, whoever he is, this is a game where he had black, and it's an old Indian. He was playing in a theme tournament, actually, and was just curious if I found any tactical tricks or serious blunders in the game. And the answer, unfortunately, is that there were quite a few. So let's kind of quickly go through this. really what I would recommend is, that one spend as much time as they can trying to figure out the tactics for themselves. I mean, if it's really, really complicated, then, it's that's one thing. But for simpler tactics, I mean, you should always try to figure them out yourself and see what you can come up with. Okay, so this was the starting position for the thematic tournament, at least for this game. And, okay, continued takes, and then c5. And this is kind of a funny move. I mean, on one level, it looks horrifying to just create this backward d6 pawn and this apparently gaping hole on d5. But while I don't think c5 is best, I don't think it's as bad as it looks either. And what black is hoping for is to have control over these dark squares. So the pawn on c5 controls d4, the pawn on d6 controls e5, and if black can somehow find a way to safely put his bishop on the h8 to a1 diagonal, could have a very good play. Alright, so queen to d2, bishop e7, queen f4. Okay, this I think is just a completely wrong plan. I mean, white should definitely not be going for some kind of kingside attack. That's just not what this position's about. So, alright, queen d2 looks a little artificial, but it's probably okay. But maybe I would prefer to keep the diagonal clear for the bishop. So even queen to d1, I mean, this looks more natural to me. Let's say bishop to e7, and now bishop to f4, for instance, would make more sense. And you can even play knight to b5, knight to d5, or knight to b5 someday, putting pressure here or occupying this central hole. I mean, this looks like the normal way to proceed. But instead, okay, queen to d2, and then queen to f4. I mean, this is... White has just gotten some kind of strange idea in his mind, and it's not very good. So castles, g4. So here he goes for the kill. Now, whenever you see your opponent start to go headhunting on the king side like this, one of the first things that you want to do is to try to see, okay, can I play in the center? By playing in the center, you're going to open the board, and by doing that, you're going to... well, if you can take over the center, then you're going to have more space, more mobility for your pieces, and it'll be easy to kind of push your opponent off to the side when he's already gone there. So you can kind of... I'm trying to think how to put this. Basically, okay, if you control the center, you control more space. If you control more space, your pieces have more mobility. Your opponent's pieces have less mobility. And... so the fact that he's going to have a little bit more pressure on the side, well, it doesn't matter because you're just going to flood through the middle of the board. You're going to take over. Plus, the white king is in the middle of the board. So here, a very good move would be knight to e5. So you're threatening the g4 pawn and centralizing this knight. It all looks good. And for instance, if white takes, already he's lost. Okay, now this variation isn't forced, but it's not all that crazy. I mean, it's something, the moves are kind of natural, and here we can see that white's attack doesn't exist, but black's does. White's king is in trouble, his queen's in trouble, and he's very far behind in development. He's just losing here. Okay, instead, black played knight to e8, which is okay. It's just not the best move. All right, h4, knight c7, and now white continued in shameless fashion to go for the attack with knight to g5. Now, here white should just play, black should just play knight to e5. This is a very good move, threatening, among other things, to maybe take twice on. Well, okay, not here, but sometimes threatening to take twice on g5 and play knight f3 check and regain the queen. But this is just a very good, simple move. Also threatening the g4 pawn. And notice the white cannot defend it with bishop to e2 because of bishop g4. The point being that on bishop g4, knight to d3 check wins white's queen. So we should probably play queen to g3, but black is a little bit better here. Okay, instead black made a serious error with bishop takes g5. Serious because after h takes g5, now white can follow up with queen to h2, and this is just this is trouble. I mean, basically we've justified all of white's crazy play here. So we got rid of our potentially great dark squared bishop, I mean, you can see again, if this bishop can safely get to this diagonal, I mean, it's magnificent there. I mean, controls e5, d4, hits c3. I mean, it's a wide open diagonal. And meanwhile, White's bishop is doing nothing really to combat it. So that's one bad point. Secondly, we're opening the h-file, which is only going to be useful for White. And thirdly, our knight can no longer use the f6 square. I mean, that would be a good defensive square for this piece. Well, that's out. So bishop g5 is a big mistake. All right, and now instead of queen f5, White should just play queen h2, and this wins a pawn. Now, Black has some compensation. So it's not a terrible position for Black, but White's position is fine, and he's up a pawn, and Black's position is not perfect either by any means. Okay, well instead, White played queen f5, g6, and now queen to d5. I'm kind of curious where he's going. And actually, Black missed a nice move here. He played knight to b6, attacking the queen and defending his d6 pawn. But see if you can think of a better move for Black here. Well, the answer is knight to d4. Threatening knight to c2 check. But if bishop to d3, we see that it threatens something even bigger, namely knight to b6, and White loses the queen. After knight to d4, Black is much better. After knight to b6, the position is only roughly equal, maybe even a little bit better for White. So queen d3, he's got another chance to play queen h3. So here Black played knight takes g5. f6 is actually interesting too, because the White king, as I mentioned, is just sitting there in the center. So given that Black is well ahead in development, it might behoove him to try to go for a little play of his own. But he played knight takes g5, which is okay. Here White should play f4 with an edge, but played knight to b5, which is just this is a tactical error. So see if you can see why this is a minor league blunder. Well, the answer is that Black has the simple tactical shot, knight takes e4. Defends the d6 pawn, and if queen takes e4, rook e8. Thank you very much for the queen. Okay, instead Black played a6, knight takes d6, bishop takes g4, and White's in plenty of trouble here too. He played knight takes b7, which is an outright blunder, and Black missed it. Okay, Black played queen takes d3. He could have just played knight to f3 check, and then wherever the king goes, next move is knight to e5 check, and Black picks up the queen. So White was fortunate. Okay, now this check, but it's too late. King goes to f1, and of course the queen's already off the board. Okay, now here again, White makes a mistake with this. The problem is that after rook a to c8, he's got too many things under attack. So plays b4, which is fine, but takes, and now if rook takes c4, Black would be clearly better. So the rook is active, White's pawns are all weak, and it's a serious advantage for Black. After knight takes c4, the position is probably about equal if White plays knight to c5, hitting the a6 pawn, plugging up the c file, and so on. Instead, though, he played a4, which is reasonable on one level. I mean, he's got this majority there, and he'd like to get it going. But here we are on move 24, and White still has three pieces that haven't even moved. They're just not doing anything at all. So Black brings his last piece into play. White makes another mistake, and after bishop to f3, it's just over. So White finally moves this rook, but maybe the only, or it's perhaps the worst time for it, but he's just dead lost anyway. Rook to d1 mate. So the moral of the story is that really White's kind of one-dimensional play killed him. So he was just going for this attack, and generally speaking was just looking for ways to be aggressive, but without bringing all his pieces into play. So remember Sirawan's famous mantra of attacking chess: invite everyone to the party. I mean, it's just so right. You don't always have to do it. Sometimes you've got enough pieces out, but as a general rule, the more pieces you got in play, the better your attacking chances are going to be. Okay, he submitted a second game as well and asked if either side could have won at some point. And the answer is yes. Both sides missed various opportunities, but I'll leave that for him to discover. And again, I don't want to have one player or one person, submit a lot of games that take time away from other people's games. So on to the next one. So this is Flint Eastwood against Katchek, and really, it's a pretty well played game, especially given that these guys are both in the 1200s. It was exceptionally well played. There are some mistakes, but not very serious. I mean, well, some are relatively serious, but overall, again, an excellently played game by the two, especially given their ratings, and even not given their ratings. I mean, it's just generally speaking very logical chess. Some errors, but more to be proud of. But one example of, let's say, a typical problem. So we move up to this position from a Chigurin Ruy Lopez, except with white playing d3 instead of d4. Here, white played f4, which is a move that he felt rather proud of, with the idea of playing queen f3 and going for pressure on the f-file and the king side in general. The problem with this, though, is that while it's a strategically good move in cases where black can't put a minor piece on e5. In other words, if black could play here e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and then let's say play this knight if we were on d7 to go to e5, or if this knight were, same thing, then black would actually be in pretty good shape. But because black can't do it here, white's actually doing reasonably well. The problem, though, is that after e takes f4, bishop takes f4, well, tactics get in the way. Do you see what white missed? It's knight takes d5. So this just grabs a pawn, and a pretty important pawn at that. I mean, black is just much better, probably objectively winning or close to winning as a result. So you got to be careful about these tactics, and that was a big one to miss. Okay, later there's another serious error, so the game continued like this. White's building up pretty logically. Again, there are places where the play could be improved, but this is very purposeful and sensible play by a 1200. Definitely not a rating that he should keep for very long if he keeps playing like this. Okay, here, a4, a3, king f8. So black's move makes a lot of sense here. Just trying to get out of the way of the G file, but this is a mistake. Okay, in the game, white played rook to f1 with the idea of playing rook to g6, and this is what happened. Fg, Fg, and here black forfeited on time, but white's in very good shape. For instance, to give a variation that white submitted and mate. Of course, this is a rather cooperative variation. Black shouldn't play rook to c8, but white's doing pretty well in any case. That's one thing I would say, by the way. I like that white really tried hard to analyze this game, but and a lot of the analysis was quite sensible. But I think often his lines were kind of undermined by not always really fighting hard to look for the best defense for the opponent. So always do that when you're analyzing a game. Don't just look for your own improvements, but look hard both in the game and in your analysis for your opponent's moves. Try your best to find the very best moves you can for him too. Anyway, back to this position. The rook f1, rook g6 idea was quite interesting, but white has a much better move here, and it's bishop to g5. Taking advantage of the fact that the rook on h8 is now unprotected, and of course that the queen is otherwise trapped. So hg, queen h8, and white's up the exchange basically for nothing. And probably the pawn, there will be a pawn too, by just doing this. Okay, so excellent submission. Okay, and we have some more games. Okay, another game of Wooge's submitted. Okay, yeah, not King Chesser, but it's the Chesser. And again, I think I'm going to I kind of want to talk about this game, but I also want to. I think I'm going to pass just as a general on principle here. That again, I prefer that kind of, let's say, give everyone a chance to participate. I do want to show one point in this game, so I'll compromise. There's one kind of cool point at the end of this. So here, white is obviously much better, but makes a mistake. So in this position, see if you can figure out what the best move for white is. So it's promising. White's well ahead in development, and all this for just one pawn. But we still have to finish the job here. So what should white do? Well, one pretty interesting move is queen to e3. This is probably good enough to win with the threat of bishop to h6, and also with the threat of queen to e7. Or at least potential threat of queen to e7. It's maybe a little bit speculative. The best move is knight to g5. Perhaps threatening knight to e6 in many lines, also threatening simply knight to f7, followed by bishop to h6 check, and on king g8 then knight to d6 is a discovered check, and winning the queen. So that kind of idea is in the air. And if f takes g5, well, bishop to e5 check wins material and probably forces a quick mate. Okay, instead of this though, white played bishop to d6, which is a mistake. If black had played bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, and rook to e8, now his position is really not so bad. So he's going to swap off some stuff, and white will have fewer attackers. Black's queen will be closer to the danger zone. So I think black is okay here. Instead, black played bishop to g4, which is greedy, and it at least seems understandable. I mean, it looks pretty promising. It doesn't look like white has anything so dangerous, but as we'll see, this is not the case. So takes, rook e7 check, king h8, and here white has at least a couple of very good moves. It could play queen to f4 with the idea of queen to h6. This should be enough to win. But what else could white do here? The move chosen by white in the game isn't bad, but there is better. So what do you think? Well, the best move here is the spectacular blow, knight to g5. Alright, the basic point is that if bishop takes f3, rook h7 is mate. Bishop on c4 is cutting off the g8 square. If f takes g5, what else, right? There's not really any other way that makes sense to defend the h7 pawn. So f takes g5, but now queen to e4 with the threats of either queen to d4 or queen to e5, followed by, in either case, by queen g7 mate. This should decide. Note that if rook to f6 here, then rook to e8 check wins the queen. So black is just completely lost here. Alright, in the game white played queen to d3. Black maybe could have played c5, taking away the d4 square and clearing c6 for the knight. This probably would have been the best try. White's still better, but white has to be careful not to let black off the hook. But instead, bishop takes d1 happened, and here white did find that same move, knight to g5, and black resigned. So very nice finishing blow. Would have been even nicer the move before, where it was a queen sack, but still, good job there. Okay, I think there's one or two more games, so let's move on to that. Okay, next one is between Cameron McKinney and Matt, and it's a King's Indian attack where white's kingside play seems to get there first, but then wasn't sure, how to kind of finish the attack there. So let's get into that. Get into the key positions. Okay, and now here white played bishop to f4, and this has been played before, but the main move is h4, and this just makes more sense to me because the bishop on f4, okay, it's not needed to defend the e5 pawn, of course, and I don't think f5 here or f6 for black is very good. So, bishop to f4 stops f5 or f6 because after e takes f6, after f6, then e takes f6, and we're hitting the bishop, and we're hitting the queen. So, bishop f4 definitely stops it, but I don't really think it needs to be stopped at this point. If f6, you take en passant, the e6 pawn is hanging except after rook f6, but there you could either play knight to g5 or bishop to g5 with a lot of pressure against that pawn. Sorry, not knight to g5 because a knight to d4, but bishop to g5 would be good. So, bishop to f4. Actually, let me just check, make sure I'm not saying things that are nonsensical. Yeah, f5 or f6 are never played here. Okay, so bishop f4, rook fe8, now h4, knight to d4, takes, knight h2, a5. Okay, so I would say the position is equal-ish here. Black's open c-file is an asset. You know, he's got some things going for him. And White's kingside play isn't too dangerous yet. So it's, you know, I think both sides can be happy. So if you don't mind this position with Black, if you don't mind being attacked, that is, then you can try it. Anyway, here White played knight to f3, which certainly isn't bad, but I would be pretty tempted to play h5, especially when you see how the game continues from here. So the idea is, of course, just to play h6 and puncture a little hole there, or maybe you can play queen to g4 and then h6, trying to create some serious dark square weaknesses in the black camp. Black could play h6, but okay, well, stay tuned. So in the game, White played knight f3, attacking the d4 pawn. Black played bishop c5. Maybe queen c5 is a little bit better, but bishop c5 is okay. Now knight to g5, threatening to play queen h5, which would be, well, it would be winning here because of the double attack. So Black played h6, and White played knight to h3. Now the question is, well, is the knight really any good on h3? Not really. He just played that so he can bring his queen to g4 or h5, I would assume. But, alright, what did he gain out of that? I mean, he could have done that anyway. Now you're thinking, well, maybe he had to induce h6 first. Well, that's why we could have played h5 before, especially given that after knight to f8, White played h5 anyway. So couldn't we have had this, you know, with several extra tempi? I mean, especially if we had played h4 instead of bishop to f4, and then not done this whole knight h2, f3, g5, h3 business. So we could have had a position like this with 2 or 3 extra tempi. Okay, here Black played queen to d8, which I think is a good move. And after g4, he should have continued to make good moves that were similar with bishop to e7, so preventing the g4, g5 advance. Instead, he played f6, which also stops g5 for the moment, but is extremely risky and positionally dubious. So e takes f6, and now Black, for I think no adequate reason, plays this pawn sack gf6. So White took e5, and White's definitely better. I mean, Black has some compensation, but White is clearly better, maybe even pretty close to winning here. So g5 was a good move. King h7, and here White said that he took his longest think of the game and got a bit antsy and wanted to try to force things on the king side and open up some lines, but was curious if there was a better continuation. And I think there is. He played g takes f6, but maybe queen f3 is best. So this threatens queen f5 check, which would be great because then we can play g6, and the bishop is free as well. So probably bishop to c8 is forced. I mean, if you play queen to d7, then you're dropping this pawn on f6. So bishop c8, and now c4, taking advantage of the pin on the long diagonal. So dc, bc, let's say takes, and this. So regains the pawn for a moment, but takes, check, here, and d4. And this just looks like it should be winning for White. They're opposite colored bishops, but this is a position where that means that can only spell trouble for the weaker side. Doesn't make it the position drawish at all. So White's up a pawn, probably about to be 2 pawns up. Very good game for him. Okay, after g takes f6, it's a bit tougher. Here, okay, White's still somewhat better, but not winning. But Black has to be careful. For instance, if he plays king takes h6, then check. Okay, he can't take the h5 pawn because queen g5 is mate. If he goes back, then knight to g5 check. And it's bad news. If his king goes to h8 or h6, then knight f7 check is a fork. winning the queen. And even if it wasn't a fork, it's discovered check. So that loses, while king g8 loses the rook to f7 check. So queen takes f6 here. This is a nice move, bishop to f3, to activate the bishop. Okay, now here, threatening knight to g5 check. So very logical play really by both sides at this point. So white's still a little bit better, but black is doing a reasonable job. And yeah, only here really does black kind of fall off the cliff. Queen takes g4, and he's still got some chances here to hold on. I mean, okay, again, prefer white, but black can fight. After king h7, though, he gets crushed. So here, rook to g1, and now a blunder. He had to play queen f8, still in trouble though, and he gets mated. So very interesting game. I think kind of the key is for white, to analyze this variation and to kind of see, okay, when should I play bishop to f4? When do I need to be afraid of, or at least aware of the possibility of f5 or f6? What do I do with the black pawn when it gets to h6? I mean, do I need to have the h5 square free for my queen? So those are the kinds of questions that you should ask, and look in the database. So look at games from this position and see, how did white proceed? How did he build his attack? What were the different black plans? There's knight to d4 ideas. There's, pushing instead of b6 a couple of moves before. I mean, it's much more common, I think, for black to play b5, because black is trying desperately to open up lines on the queen side. I mean, that's how he's going to get his active play here. So very interesting game, very good game to study, and I wish him all success in the future playing this variation. Okay, next one. This is from Zidane, and he had black in this game, so let's flip it around. And yeah, okay, this was a game where he felt that he had a good position until the last few moves, and well, we'll get to what he was looking at, but basically he seemed to think that he should head for a certain kind of ending, which I think was actually mistaken. So it's kind of interesting. So he was kind of consistent in trying to follow through with a plan, but it turned out to be a very bad plan. Okay, well, let's take a look at the game. So black is a Class A player, and he said his opponent was a very strong player. Didn't specify how strong, but I think you can see at the end he plays quite well. Okay, so we've got a scotch, and this interesting sideline where white's playing for control over the d5 square. But it's got to be very careful. There was a great game back in 2006 where white played a4, which was considered up to that point a very useful move to make. Grabbing some space on the queen side and trying to get a bit of a concession. Because if black plays a5 or a6, then knight to d5 can be kind of nasty, threatening not only to take on f6, but also to destroy black's queenside pawn structure with knight takes on b6. So let me just illustrate what I'm talking about instead of going on and on. So let's say knight to d5, hitting this, and if g5, then taking on b6. And you can see, whoops, you can see some pressure against this pawn here becomes a possibility. All right, I don't know if this is exactly the way to do it, because maybe knight takes e4 is sound here. But this is at least the general idea. Maybe knight e4, bishop c4. Okay, definitely some good counterplay for white. Definitely good compensation. All right, but anyway, all of this is academic. So the a4 idea fails miserably to the following brilliant idea. And this was played first in a game, at least I think it was played first, in the 2006 game On against Ruck. And it went knight takes e4. So fantastic blow. If knight takes e4, then queen takes h4, and black's just up a pawn for nothing. So bishop takes d8, bishop f2 check, bishop to g4 check, and now he doesn't take the queen, but he plays knight e5 check, sacrificing still more material. King takes e4, f5 check, and now rook takes d8. And black is winning in this position, and went on to win some moves later. So fantastic idea. I don't know if it was homework or an over-the-board inspiration, but It was really outstanding and won one of the great games of that year. So even here, I mean, white's up a queen for just 2 pawns, but with the king on e5, or sorry, on d5, it's not long for the world. I mean, it's going to get driven to f6, or sorry, to e6, and probably not last very long after that. Oh no. Oh wait, no, I'm okay. Sorry, I was kind of groaning there for a second because I thought I had the microphone unplugged, but it was a different cable. Whew. Okay, so sorry about that groan. Kind of amusing there, and I'm glad that it is amusing and not not something that was groan worthy. Okay, well, back to this game. White played bishop to d3, which is perfectly acceptable, and I'm just going to kind of zip through the moves here for a while, and just say that. Okay, anyway, black can play knight to e5 really at any time here, and he finally does here, and black is just a little bit better here, and black enjoys almost even a clear advantage. I mean, his bishop, his dark squared bishop is very good. In fact, both of his bishops are good. White's bishop on f3 is not good. Black is ahead in development, just a tiny bit, but still, all of these things put together give him a nice edge here. Okay, queen e2, and here I think black starts to go astray. He plays c6, which is a logical move, but there's a problem with it, and it's that white can play, and should play, but doesn't play, knight to a4, aiming to either swap off this bishop or to put a knight on c5 in case the bishop retreats. So I think the best move here is a6. So that way we keep the bishop on this fantastic diagonal. So knight a4, no big deal, we go back to a7. The c5 square is completely covered, and black is almost clearly better here. I mean, it's a pretty nice edge. So anyway, you got a second chance because of rook a to d1. So here, again, you should play a6, but he plays knight to h7. Okay, white should play knight to a4, but takes, rook to d1. And I think black is clearly better here. One way to proceed is rook takes d1. All right, if white takes with the queen, then queen h4, we're hitting f2. And after queen to e2, knight to g5. And definitely I think white is getting in trouble here. I mean, you can see there are all these tactical possibilities starting to show up, and black's bishops are great. I mean, all of his pieces are great here, while almost all of white's pieces are very passive. Okay, knight takes d1 is probably a little bit better, but still, let's say queen to d8, grab the open file, and then knight to g5. And again, black is definitely for choice here. So he played knight to f8, which, okay, the idea is maybe to play knight to g6, knight f4. So it's not a bad idea, but just going to g5 was even better. Okay, so takes, bishop to g4, and this too is a bit of progress for white. Okay, well here, I would prefer not to make this exchange on b3, but knight a4, c5 is again kind of a little bit of a threat. So takes is fine. But now here, around here, I think black comes up with this very bad plan of, I mean, he says that he's trying to play for this knight against white's light squared bishop. And maybe his thought is that, okay, white has the pawn on e4. And because this pawn's on e4, maybe he felt that this bishop on g4 wasn't really such a good piece. But I think that this really isn't so. I think this bishop is, in fact, quite good. Maybe it would be even better if there wasn't a pawn on g4, but it's a decent piece. So I would not really, let's say, head for an ending where it's just that bishop against my knight. I think that would definitely favor white. So what would I do? Well, one thing to bear in mind is that when you've got, well, when you have one bishop, and only one bishop, generally speaking, not always, but as a rule of thumb, you often want to put the pawns on the opposite color of your own bishop. Why? Well, so that way it helps to cover the squares that your bishop can't. So the pawns on light squares can do what your bishop can't do, and vice versa. Also, it's useful here because it can restrict his bishop. Now, you have to be careful. I mean, sometimes putting all of your pawns on the same color as the other guy's bishop just makes them a target. But as long as your pawns are safe, it can serve to restrict the bishop rather than to foster its aggressive prospects. So g6, I think, would be quite reasonable. And you can play king g7, maybe knight h7, knight f6, and activate your position. Okay, instead f6. I mean, this just makes Swiss cheese. So if the thought was that playing like this would remove all the targets from the white bishop, well, yeah, the pawns aren't going to be targets, but it gives all of his pieces now free room to go exploring into your position. So f6, I think, is a big mistake, and it's, let's say, part of an overall even bigger mistake. I mean, this is what black is aiming to do. So g3, I think, is quite reasonable and in keeping with what I had said before. Now black again, I think, should play g6, h5, king g7. And this, I think, would at least reduce the damage. The position would be roughly equal. Instead, okay, king f7 and king e7 just strikes me as, okay, not, we don't want to say crazy, but it's definitely underestimating the danger and the prospects that white has, thanks to the really weak light squares that black now has, thanks to moves like f6. So knight a4 is not a bad move. Okay, bishop to a5 is, I think, just one more dubious move, but part of this overall plan. Here, white should just play queen to c4, I think, already starting to go digging around black's position, threatening queen to c5 check. But okay, c3 happened, and maybe what black had a last good chance to stay in the game with b5, and then bishop to b6. So this keeps the white queen off of c4, kicks this aggressive knight out, and black should still be okay here. Okay, instead, after bishop to b6, this time white did spot queen to c4, and now black is in increasing danger. Queen to d2 is one more mistake. Takes, check, and white's going to take on b6 and have very good play here. Maybe black's best is c5, but it's already close to lost, if not lost already. But the key thing here, the one move that makes this line okay, is knight to d7. So again, black is in trouble here, but at least it's not resignable just yet. Okay, in the game, king to e8 was played, and after this series of captures, black is just completely lost here. The threat's bishop to h5 check, and but also to take on f6 and then on e5 or h6. Black can't hold this together. So he checked and played this, but what does he do now? The only move, he played queen to g6, which loses the knight to this, and here black resigned. But even after the better queen to b4, then check, queen f6, and black is going to end up 2 or 3 pawns down in this ending with a lost position. So really the key was just black's choice of a very, very bad plan, and perhaps, again, this was caused by just gravely underestimating the weakness of the light squares. Now, if the queens had been off the board, maybe you can do something like that. Then that can be a possibility. Although even there, I would still be kind of hesitant to just make my light squares so weak. I mean, there's just no need for it. But with the queens on, it was more or less a suicidal plan, really, which was a pity because black had played the first part of the game extremely well. Okay, there might be one more game. Nope, no more games. So yeah, that was just my note to say that I'm caught up through this date. All right, so I hope you guys benefited from this. It was a lot of games. Some interesting tactical points, some strategic points, but again, overall, I hope you found it interesting and instructive, and I will see you all next week. Not with more viewer games, so that more viewer games will have to wait, but we'll find something of interest, I hope. All right, take care. See you next week. Bye-bye.